right. Next, I want to bring on Dr. Dibinga. You've seen him on the show. He's been here lots of times. He's a recurring guest. He is a professor of cross-cultural studies at American University. Welcome back, Dr. Dibinga. Uh,
Having me. Happy to be here.
we got
Always.
to start with that women's history trivia question. Who coined the phrase white fragility? Is it Jane Elliott, Peggy McIntosh, or Robin DiAngelo? Help us out, Dr. Dibinga.
Robin DiAngelo, powerful book, White Fragility.
Okay, Robin is a best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author. I think that book stayed on the New York Times best-selling list for over a year.
Yes.
Gained in more prominence after the civil unrest of 2020, the summer. She's a former professor. She has a PhD in multicultural education from the University of Washington. So this book, for some, it's the Bible. It just lays it all out when it talks about
Mhm.
white privilege, talks about how white people get defensive when the term is used.
Mhm.
She argues that structural racism is not intentional, but a lot of people say, hey, this book is just a bunch of propaganda and it makes white folks responsible and blames them for everything. What do you think, Dr. Dibinga?
I think that it's a very powerful book. I've been working in our school systems for over 20 years, public, private, and charter schools. And I can't tell you how many times I've had situations where a white principal or a white teacher would say that, well, I'm able to say this to my white parents because they're going to receive it a little bit better. Now, for me, I never cared. If I have something on my mind, I'm going to speak it. But there were a lot of other Black teachers and non-white teachers who felt like they couldn't have those conversations unless it came from a white person. And so what Robin is doing in her book, which is incredible, is she's having that conversation with white people. She's talking to them about their proximity to white people. Why are the interactions we have with Black people, I should say, always at a distance, or why are they stereotypes? She talks about characters like the donkey in Shrek and how, the Black experience that we see is something that we get from television and the like. And quite honestly and unfortunately, there are a lot of white people who are not ready to have that conversation at all, but definitely not with somebody who is not white. And so that's why I think her book is so powerful and why it's a constant presence on the bestsellers list.
Yeah, she uses the phrase white fragility to really describe white people who get defensive,
Yes.
who get defensive when they're questioned about race or they're made to think about, their own privilege. And that's why I think a lot of folks attack her, and she's been criticized. Some folks say again that the book blames white people, but one thing I think is really, really poignant about the book that I love is that she criticizes white liberals and progressives who view themselves as quote unquote woke. And she says that a lot of those people who are trying to be allies or accomplices, as Frederick likes to say, are avoiding any questions about race or their own privileges. And she confronts them on that. And again, in your situation as a professor, being in education, have you had those experiences where you're talking to someone who says, look, I get it. I marched, with the protesters. I've
Mhm.
been out there with Black Lives Matter. I changed my Instagram account to the Black Squares. I have
Yes.
my Black friends. They got the checklist of, I
Mhm.
do all the Black stuff. But you just want
Mhm.
to say to them, but wait a minute, you know, it's deeper than that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, Frederick Douglass even talked about this, and Dr. King spoke about this, about how the white liberals can be more of a problem than even some of the white racists. And so, yes, I've definitely encountered students who may use this particular language that they feel like they are part of this movement, they are part of the culture. But what happens is they ultimately end up dominating the movement. And that's when it becomes problematic. And that's why I'm actually not a fan of the term allyship or accomplices. I'm more of a proponent of the term partners, because I believe that the term allies, even though I used to use it, it's become a little bit arrogant, right? People, I'm descending here as your ally. And then what happens from there is that people lose their own power. But when you're partners, you're part of the same team. Allies go to the game and cheer for their team and then they go home. Partners are in the game fighting for that ring because they realize that I'm not free until you are free and you are not free until I am free. And so we need to get to that point where we're working together, because at the end of the day, we have to do this for each other and not to stroke our own egos. And unfortunately, I do teach students who do believe that to this day. And those are
I
some of the
love
great
that you
conversations we have.
I love that you're making that distinction because you're so right. Someone can be an ally, but do they have skin in the game? That's what we're really
Yep.
talking about. Do you really see that my advancement is inextricably tied to your advancement? That
That's right.
we have this intersectionality that, you do better because I do better, and I do better because you do better. You know, the white privilege term, and what do you think about it? Some folks say we should stop using it. White people, some get very defensive because they say, look, I don't have any privilege. I can't get a job. I'm unemployed. I can't live in, a good neighborhood. I may get food stamps. I've had to work hard all my life to get where I am. Nobody's given me anything. And so when they hear the word privilege, they think it somehow goes to merit or something that they've earned. So do you think we could capture more people in this conversation if we found different language?
I don't think so. I don't think we need to find different language. I think that people are always going to find ways to refute things that they just don't want to hear or believe. So before we get to white, the term privilege itself is real. I'm a man. I've experienced a lot of racism as a Black person, but if heaven forbid I experience some form of sexual assault, no one's going to ask what I was wearing. That's male privilege. As a Black person, when I travel overseas with my US passport, I've had a certain type of privilege attached with that. I'm almost treated like a white person in some of the countries that I go to that are majority Black and brown. So privilege is real. It's just that white privilege has been at the center of it for so long because we live in a system that was based off of white privilege. The system of racism that we know is about 600 years old, and it was created to justify slavery. And more to your point, when people say, well, I didn't get any help, I didn't get anything, let's just give the one example of the GI Bill. When soldiers came back from World War II and got access to housing and bank loans and school and education, but Black soldiers didn't get that. So yes, your grandfather and great-grandfather may have worked hard, but they got access to opportunities that my grandparents, your grandparents, could not get. So it's not taking anything away from the hard work that they did, but when it was time for them to reap their rewards, we didn't have access to those same rewards. And that was the case in housing, it was a case of employment, it was a case in our educational system. And so we have to be honest about that. It doesn't take away from your hard work, it just speaks truth to the reality.
And Dr. Dibinga, people will say, yeah, that was my grandfather. He might have gotten that GI Bill, but I went to the bank yesterday and applied for a loan and I got turned down. So I wasn't treated any differently or any better, than the Black person or the brown person. So people find ways to make these, false distinctions that don't mean anything. Jane Elliott, who, is a very well-known, respected anti-racist scholar, talks about unearned benefits. Do you think, I know you just said you don't think the language matters because people will find a way to dispute the language, but she uses unearned benefits. Does that resonate any differently to you than, privilege?
I respect why she does that, and she's been doing this work forever, and she's seen this firsthand. So I'm completely respectful of that term, unearned benefits. And I'm sure she would probably say that even with that, she still experiences a certain level of pushback from people. But unearned benefits, that is real as well. And I think that is a language that should be part of the conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I was trying to get Frederick, I was, talking to him about this concept of different privilege. So your male privilege, again, nothing that you had anything to do with. That's your parents,
Right.
they got together, had sex, had a baby, and guess what? It was a man.
Mm-hmm.
And white privilege, same thing. DNA just happens. I talk about my education privilege because, I have an Ivy League education. So I have education privilege, but I had to do something for that. If I didn't study, I wouldn't have gotten into college. If I didn't study, I wouldn't have gotten into law school. If I didn't study, I wouldn't have passed the bar. So is it appropriate to talk about these privileges in the same conversation? Because my education privilege is very different than that white privilege.
Well, that takes us right back to what you were saying about Jane Elliott, right? It's unearned privileges versus the earned privileges. You fought for everything that you have today, and that's real. And a lot of people don't want to have that discussion because they are still dealing with their unearned privileges, but they want to speak as if their unearned privileges are just as important and merit-worthy as our earned privileges. And so, yes, that absolutely has to be added to the conversation because they cannot be equated.
Yeah, we've got to leave it there, Dr. Dibinga. Always such enlightening conversations with you. Your voice is so critical on so many issues, particularly this issue of race and privilege. Thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
All right.